first you have to understand what type of discontent you're experiencing. Second, you have to understand what's driving the discontent. You can start by thinking about well-being is a place to start, but it's not a finish. When we interact with countries, I like to say you have a math problem. And first you have to understand what's making rural citizens unhappy. And then you have to see if the policies that are being applied are connected to what's driving rural dissatisfaction. And most times these elements are not being measured at the granular level. So there's a conception that you think you understand why rural is reacting in a certain way. So what's driving discontent? But then maybe if you're not measuring or making an attempt to understand it at that granular level, that's where it starts with that discontent. So I always say, try to understand the discontent that you're experiencing, and then you can start to think about how to ensure that your policies are connecting to those areas. I always say in the OECD, there are things that you can do. The soft issues that we don't talk about enough are the issues that help. Participatory governance, bringing actors to the table, meaningful consultation, meaningful engagement, having rural citizens and communities and farmers co-design the measures that will be implemented to affect them. Those are things that are not, maybe those are tools that are not used enough that could help to go a long way to generate buy-in, engagement from the community, and go a long way to responding to that discontent or mitigating the discontent. Thank you. That's an important question. So for a very long time, we need to understand first that policies often are designed in urban spaces, so in capitals, and so they tend to have less understanding of how services need to be delivered in rural and remote rural places, the needs of rural citizens. So what happens is when policy is applied, whether it's a housing policy, a transportation policy, economic development policy, if it has a one-size-fits-all approach, then it's not going to pick up on the specificities or the needs in rural areas, and that sometimes results over time in an imbalance. So places become more unequal because maybe they're not benefiting from the policies as it's designed. And that's where rural proofing comes in. And that's why we always encourage countries to think about how you're going to apply this transportation policy. What does rural transportation look like? What are the needs of rural citizens to get back and forth? And so the difficulty comes in first thinking about or seeing policies as having to be differentiated. In the OECD, we say you have to understand the different types of ruralities within your region. A rural area adjacent to an urban area will have different needs than a rural area that's mid-size or further away versus a rural area that's more remote. So differentiated policies will have more impact in rural areas. And that's a challenge for countries because that's, to be frank, more work. Communication, communication, communication. Effective rural communication is key. We find more and more that sometimes, especially around environmental and climate policies, that it's designed, drafted, developed, and executed, but the impact of it will have the rural areas are often on the front lines of its deployment, and they rarely have the understanding of what needs to be done and the implications. And so what more can be done to emphasize designing effective rural communication strategies very early on, particularly on policies that will have impact rural areas the highest, and potentially will cause more resistance. And so we find that sometimes what kills a policy is not its design. It could be a very good policy and policy that's well intentioned. But if it's not communicated well, and if community rural actors are not at the table early to help think about alternatives, to help develop buy-in and cultivate co-creation of execution, the policy will fail and it will have negative, and there will be resistance. Well, first we have to think about it. Integrated, as we talk about it here, is really about more cross-government action. So we need departments of environment to coordinate with departments of labor, to coordinate with departments of education. That in of itself is already a large hurdle that is a challenge for all countries, because every ministry has its mandate that has to be deployed. So working across government is already a challenge. Then the extra ask that we're asking is then when you are thinking about rural development, which we argue at the OECD is a policy that is a whole of government policy almost, because even though you have rural departments, whether they're within departments of agriculture or external to departments of agriculture, they also rely on other ministries to be effective. The ministries of education, ministries of transport for access to services, Ministry of Health, etc. So it's a challenge because cross-government challenge and coordination is simple on paper but difficult in practice. And so that requires a lot more work. Now it's being done, but it's slow, and we also have to assist that by helping with better comprehension of rural and the value that rural areas bring to recognizing or realizing different ministerial mandates. I want to say there are a number of countries that are undertaking rural proofing. Success and how you measure success is relative. What I will say is that there are a number of countries that are doing rural proofing, and they are pushing forward to enhance their process to ensure that it works. So again, it's a learning by doing approach where you try to find the right methodology, package of evidence, and ways to ensure that the rural proofer is using the systems or the packages that you give them to rural proof in a way that enhances policy. But how you measure success is relative, because you could have a policy that was rural proofed, but for whatever reason, the decision maker didn't change his mind or went ahead, even though it was going to have a negative consequence. That's why in the paper, I talk a bit about how do you measure success, because rural proofing cannot change a policymaker's mind. It's the process of giving them evidence so that they are aware of the potential outcomes of the policy on, or the potential impact of the policy on a rural area. You asked for an example of where maybe it's happening a bit more organically, or a country where it's a bit more advanced, and I would say that would be Finland, right? Even though if you talk to the Finnish government, they will tell you there's more that they can do, but the Finnish government is probably the most advanced in its whole of government application of rural proofing. But even within that, they are still making changes and trying to improve it. To be honest, this is the cornerstone of pretty much all your questions. And it goes back actually to a number of your questions before. We know, going back to cross government coordination, we know that rural sometimes has a negative connotation to it. Negative meaning sometimes When you talk to policymakers, it's almost like rural is the stepchild, or rural is always a disadvantaged region that needs support. And so it's not seen as a contributor, as an equal partner at the table. So the narrative shift that we are encouraging everyone to take is to see rural as places of opportunity, to see rural as the place where if you have these climate change goals, you cannot realize your climate change goals without partnering equally with rural areas. You cannot, so this changing that narrative from rural as disadvantaged to rural as an equal opportunity, as an equal partner who should be at the table early to negotiate equally and in lockstep with urban. And that narrative shift would allow for better coordination, because you're not seeing rural as a disadvantaged place that has to be remembered, but as an equal contributor to national growth. Hence, tailoring policies to support them will only enhance the overarching goal of the country of, of improving national growth.